Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today. I'm excited about this panel. My name is Sarah Mackintosh. I run a policy advocacy initiative called Cleantech for UK, where we advocate for better policy from government to ensure that clean tech innovation can thrive in the UK. If I allow my colleagues to introduce themselves, Ruth, should we start with you?
Yes, Ruth Herbert. I'm the Chief Executive of the Carbon Capture and Storage Association. We're a trade association representing over 120 members in the carbon capture, utilisation and storage value chain. So people developing technology for capture, transporting CO2, storing it, the supply chain and supporting service sectors.
Yes, good morning everyone. My name is Øistein Jensen. I'm a Norwegian. I'm representing Odfjell, and I'm the Chief Sustainability of Odfjell, which is a shipping company. We're operating a large fleet of tankers operating all around the world when we are carrying anything liquid, bulk liquids. And we're also invested in terminals around the world and also represent then one of the hard-to-abate sectors that will need to do a significant amount of work in order to follow the trajectories for the energy transition.
Hi, good morning everyone. My name is Unzall. I'm here from ACT Group. So we are one of the largest global providers of market-based decarbonisation solutions. Essentially, we work with the industrial sector and the hard-to-abate sector to facilitate their energy transition, their green gas transition, their biofuel transition as well. And we've been in these markets as a player now for 15 years, so really working with companies in this space, and we're speaking from that perspective.
Hello everyone, my name is Muldowney. I work for BNP Paribas. BNP Paribas is a French bank, the largest bank in the European Union. And I sit within what we call our low carbon transition group. And that's a group of 200 bankers around the world who focus on helping our clients take advantage of the opportunities and meet some of the challenges of the energy transition.
Great, thank you. So today we're going to be talking about partnerships, and I've got some questions for the panel, but I might start by talking about why partnerships are important to me. So my group is funded by Breakthrough Energy, which is Bill Gates's energy philanthropic arm of his energy company, and I work on behalf of a coalition of venture capitalists and company builders. So for us, partnerships are very important. We work together to create skategy to influence government and find better policy. But the question I've got for the panel, and I'll start with you, Ruth, is why are partnerships so important to you through the transition? How have they changed over time, and what more do you think needs to happen?
I think there's a number of angles to look at this for the CCSA. As a trade association, we inherently are a partnership of companies who come together to try to understand how to advance that industry. And we're focused on enabling net zero goals as well as sustainable development across regions and nations. But what that means actually is, these processes that happen for decarbonisation of heavy industry, for example, they require people in the manufacturing sector to think about having an innovative new technology on their site and engaging with all of the commercial and technology and commercial requirements that brings, and trying to think about how to finance that new development and how it will pay for itself when it's operating, because obviously the carbon price isn't high enough at the moment to cover that. And so they're grappling with an uncertain future, but they've got to the way to mitigate closing down as a business if they can't decarbonise is to have this innovative technology. They've got to actually understand the technology, engage with technology developers, and not just on their site, but then think about, well, where will that CO2 then go? When is my risk over and I say goodbye to that, and that goes along the chain and is stored somewhere. So these sort of value chain of CCUS and the risks along it is what we've spent several years with the UK government, and also people are looking at this around the world as to how is how the risk's going to be borne in that sort of business process by the appropriate person at every step along the chain of that CO2. How is it monitored, reported and all those other things, and then how does the business of CCUS work in terms of where the money flows, where the risks flow, and then ultimately, you know, at the end of that, you've got a low carbon product that you've manufactured. How do you like recoup the value of that product from the product market? How do you get customers to see that as a different product? Because it looks the same, but it's low carbon, so it's much higher quality product, much more competitive industry. But you know, you need the markets then for selling that, and it's not just the commodities market. You're going to need long-term take-off agreements for products. You've typically had much shorter business cycles, so it's always like re-engineering, rewiring our whole economy as to how we buy and sell things and make things and build things, and that's huge. And no one company in one sector can take that all on to try to get a project built. They have to join together with others in their sector, but also across sectors, because everyone's seeing the same problem. And so even within our trade association, we're trying to solve the CCUS value chain, get the incentives in place from the government. Then we're also sitting alongside, you know, renewables and other technologies in the industrial sectors that also need to happen. And kind of the messages are really the same, I think, in many cases, which is we need a lot more long-term visibility of where those markets are heading to be able to make these kind of investments. So it's an ecosystem, but I think this is unusual for industry to collaborate with people you've traditionally competed with in your sector for business, and maybe then to collaborate with a business that's in your supply chain or that you supply, that is normally a client, but you've got to try to kind of meet in the middle. These are really, boards aren't set up to deal with some of these kind of situations, and I spend a lot of time working with boards to help them understand how to navigate those uncertainties.
How's that going?
Well, I think when they look at a project and they sort of see the business case of the project is clear, the climate need for the project is clear, but there are not boundaries where there should be. You know, the fact that what another company does in a totally different sector that has no relationship to them at all legally in any way, which just happens to be a few, you know, half a kilometre down the road from them, but because they're going to be connected to the same CO2 pipe, what they do might cause a risk for what they are doing in their project. This is something that we just don't have the frameworks to manage, so it's about getting everyone to lean into that a bit, but also working with things like the insurance industry to understand how they can start to create products that help people manage some of these sort of shared risks in a way that's like manageable for a board, and you can sort of say, right, there is a mitigation or there is a product to deal with that.
And is that the same for you in your industry? Are you finding similar things, or?
Well, just to put it in a frame from the shipping industry, about 80% of all goods that we surround ourselves with has been transported on a ship, and that means that due to just the size and the volume of that shipping can provide, it is the most energy efficient way of transporting large volumes over large distances. So that means that shipping in itself is one of the major solutions in order to decarbonize transportation. The challenge with shipping is that in order to transport large volumes over large distances, there are no today other commercially alternatives than a combustion engine. And a combustion engine that has to run on a fuel, and today there are only fossil fuel available. There are other fuels, alternative fuels, and we'll probably hear more about that later. You were talking about methanol, ammonia. They can be produced green. There's almost zero production of green fuels available for shipping, and so that is one of the absolutely big dilemmas. That is one element, and the shipping industry represents about 2 to 3% of global emissions. So that means that, as you mentioned, this challenge is not something one company can do by themselves. So in order for us to make that work, from my company to be able to do that, we need to have access to fuel, we need to have access to infrastructure, we need to have regulations in place in order to get the fuels, we need to have financing, and we need to also have customers helping us share the risk and share the burden of the extra cost. Because one thing that we now know is that the next fuel is going to be much more expensive. Because either you have to do after treatment like the carbon capture, or you need to produce it green, and that's going to be much more expensive, and it will be a fight and a competition for those molecules. So in order for us to handle that challenge, you need to do partnership, or you need to do strong business relations with others that you have not done before. And we have seen that in many other shipping companies that are closer to the end consumers, like a car transportation company, right? A shipping company that transport cars that are produced green. They see a willingness of their customers to pay more for that. In our segment, where we transport chemicals, we don't yet. So I think that going forward, you will have to see partnerships that you have not seen before, that the customers much more involved. You need to make sure that you get the banks much more involved, that you have the sustainable financing links. So I think that echo your perspective. It's a massive challenge that we cannot do ourselves, and you need to collaborate across the value chain.
Thanks. Unzall, would you agree with that?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, this ties in really nicely to what ACT does, not just with the industrial sector, but across all companies who are facing similar issues to Odfjell, for example, in the shipping industry. But really, when we look at partnerships, it's about partnering with an organization and stakeholders within an organization in two main ways. So on the one hand, if they maybe don't understand that these solutions are available and they are out there, they're just on what we call the wholesale market. You're not going to get it from your utility. You're not going to get it from your tariff provider, let's say, but you'll need to understand a slightly more strategic way to approach the market. So that's where we come in to partner with the organization and really educate them on, okay, the renewable energy market, for example, is very volatile. It moves up and down at different points in the year. How can you make your procurement more strategic so that your energy transition is also financially viable and financially sustainable? And I think that's what makes these partnerships so critical, because at the end of the day, although the hard-to-abate sector and industry is a very large emitter, they're also a business. So to facilitate and to stay on track with your energy transition, it needs to be commercially interesting, first of all, and it needs to be financially viable. Otherwise, it's not possible, really, to stay on a midterm or a longer-term track for energy transition. So that's what we look at, and then I think this ties in really nicely to your point earlier as well, Ruth, around lower carbon products. So understanding that when we speak to an organization about the source of their emissions for product production, whether that's methane or whether that's a fuel, what is the bio-equivalent out there in the market, and then how can they better understand how to make their low-carbon product line successful in a way that they can then market it to the consumer and actually make it available to purchase, so that they then have, as I say, that kind of longer-term picture of their cash flow, of how to make this a succinct model. And I'll touch on a couple of other points about how partnership then extends beyond just the private sector to facilitate this, but really it's about more transparency, better understanding of these markets, and then also more autonomy for an organization on how to make this a longer-term successful transition.
Mark.
Thanks. Well, we're in danger of all agreeing, so I'll try and add maybe a sharper edge to the discussion, because we're talking about partnership, and partnership's a lovely word, but what we're really talking about is risk transfer. Who is going to take the risk in which situations? And these are the sort of partnership areas that we're discussing. If we're looking at particular assets, particularly those in the hard-to-transition sectors, we're talking about real costs, huge risks, existential risks for some companies going forward. And as the other panel members have said, everyone sort of understands what the problem is, and there's probably also a broad agreement on the range of solutions. What there's not is a broad acceptance of where the risks of transition need to sit and who's going to pay for it. And there are various parties who can pay for it, and there are lots of advocacy bodies, industry organizations, etc. Possibly even banks have been responsible for this too, looking to governments and saying that governments have got to absorb that risk, or the taxpayers, or finding mechanisms for these risks to come through. And often governments can play an extremely valuable role in this by the facilitation through the regulatory processes, or by removing certain regulatory processes, by taking certain risks of other companies in a value chain collapsing, which is one of the key credit concerns when you're talking about the hard-to-abate sectors, and in providing stability to pricing. Sometimes those would actually be subsidies, but often not so much subsidies, but some level of stability. But also it's going to be necessary for industry to find a way to do these things. I'll give an example that we were involved in. We were working with a company called Northvolt. It's a Swedish company that's building a very large battery factory in northern Sweden. And they had a fantastic idea, which was to construct the greenest battery ever using renewable electricity, widely available in this particular part of Sweden. But the challenge was to find a commercial structure and a risk transfer structure that would enable people to invest equity in the business, that would enable lenders to lend money to a new business, essentially a startup. And one of the solutions found in the end was to talk to the customers of that business, who were mostly large automotive companies, particularly those based in Germany, who were willing, because they wanted this product, they needed this product as part of their own transformation, to enter into sales agreements for much longer periods than they would otherwise have done. And this helped give a lot of confidence to lenders and to investors, and so that everyone, by working together, finding ways to take a little bit more risk than all of the participants were used to doing in the past, to find what we'll call for these purposes a partnership, but a series of risk-sharing agreements that could allow an investment that will be over $10 billion when it's completed to be financed. And we need to work through in a very systematic way for lots of hard-to-abate sectors for these sorts of investments, because often, of course, we're talking about vast amounts of money, and that money is out there. And we talk to investors and lenders all the time who wish to commit significant funds to the energy transition, and who are excited about the opportunities. But turning that into truly investable propositions, that's a very interesting challenge.
If I can comment on some of the financing, because I think that is a very good example of partnership. We probably haven't called it partnership, but it's basically what it is. In our company, we set ourselves ambitious climate targets, and then we created a sustainable linked financing framework, where we committed to trajectories in order to achieve certain climate targets, and we connected that to the financing. That means that we were penalized if we're not able to achieve it under the financing. And that was a very new product when we did that back in 2020. I think we were the 5th company in the world to actually do that. What it did is that it attracted a lot of new investors. It attracted companies that have said no to the shipping sector, because this was something new. Then that means that you were able to do financing that you possibly could not have done before. So you see a benefit on that. And we saw there was a substantially oversubscribed the bond that we did, and we have done a lot of loans under the same framework afterwards. And that put a pressure on the rate, and that brings the financing cost down. So, but that was it was a general purpose financing. But what we did now this summer is that we did a transition finance framework. And that was also one of the first that is done, and glad to see that we have BNP Paribas on the book there as well. So, but what that framework does, it connects the transitional activities. It's a user proceeds financing, go directly into the activities that we do, like financing, because we are now fitting sails on our ships. We're going back 100 years. We're fitting sails on the vessels. And in order to share the risk, as you mentioned, on that, we're trying to share that with our customers, but we're also trying to share that with our banks and financing. So what we do is that we are allocating the cost of that into the transition financing. So it's dedicated and it's certified, and you get all this third-party verification of that. And I think that that's just a good example of multiple parties coming together to drive the decarbonization effort.
Thanks. So we've talked a lot about, positive partnerships, hearing about risk sharing and business culture really having to change in order to accept all of this. And I'm just wondering if you've got examples of where it's gone well, where it's gone less well, and maybe Ruth, I'll start with you.
Yeah, thanks. So I think, I described earlier the sort of outlook for a single manufacturing company looking at this complexity, but actually one of the things that the government did through the Industrial Decarbonisation Challenge was to provide innovation funding to areas around the UK, cluster regions essentially, to create their net zero cluster plans. And what that did was bring together a whole range of different emitters, whether that's a glass manufacturer, cement factory, etc., together in different areas around the UK, and get them to plan out, okay, we all need a CO2 pipe to go near our factory. What does that network, what is the cheapest way of designing that shared infrastructure? Because, it's a long time since we built our gas grid or electricity grid. We've now got to build kind of a whole new grid. The good news is these are kind of cluster regions where there's lots of emitters, sometimes in business parks, very close together, because they've naturally gathered around the port to access the shipping, or they've naturally gathered where the power, the power stations have been put there as well to be near to the business. So the sort of the way the economy works, that they are all clustered together, but you've still got to design that network. And so that work was done and funded, and it was co-funded. All the companies put a bit of money in, they matched the government money, and they did some really good design work. And these clusters didn't just have CO2 infrastructure, they also had hydrogen pipelines, they also had floating offshore wind and extra grid connection. They looked at everything they needed, and they looked at optimizing what is the best way for our place to decarbonise. And each one was unique, because each place has its own geography, its own offshore geology for CO2 storage, or maybe it doesn't have that and it needs to do CO2 shipping to a nearby store. So these were kind of, I thought they were really good examples of what happens when not just local businesses, the technology developers, the designers, consultants, but also the local governments, local authorities came together and looked at how to put these things together. So that work led to the UK CCSA Cluster Programme and also lots of other initiatives in the regions. And we still needed the government funding for the large-scale deployment, and the programme is underway at the moment to allocate that funding. But I think the work that was done to bring businesses together and to start thinking collectively about their local shared infrastructure was really valuable. And we'd really like to see more funding for that going forward, because there were only a handful of clusters. There are more places around the UK that need to start looking at things in that way. But I would say that's a really strong example. And those clusters now have identities, branding. In many cases, they've stayed together as companies and developed shared branding and shared advocacy and design work beyond the government funding. So, and have applied to the government funding programme. So I'd say that was a very strong example.
So a success and a failure story with you on it. We saw that the big Danish ship owner Øistein, they did a decision to build a multi-fuel methanol carrier ships. And they did it in partnership with the Cargill, one of the big trading commodity houses. And they agreed on a long-term contract with the customer, and then able to share the risk. So great success, right? So we wanted to see what can we do. We invested in biofuel in order to bring down the emission. We talked to our customers and I said, okay, if you are with us on this and sharing those costs, it will bring the emissions down, and it will bring your footprint down, because we're reporting that it's their scope 3. they didn't even answer. So there's no interest in our segment in that business-to-business area. I think that you will see that, as I mentioned, in the car industry. You have the companies like BMW, Microsoft, Amazon, Puma. The customers there and the companies require that transportation to be zero. If you're talking to the big chemical producers, oil producers, zero. So I hope that will come, but that's an area where we would like to see. Ideally, you would have long-term contracts, sharing risk. At the moment, we don't see that.
And do you think government will have a role in bringing that forward?
I think that will require a long answer, but I'll try to make it very short. So what we would encourage to put a levy on CO2 emission, put the cost on carbon. So it polluter pays. So someone needs to pay for that. In substance, and the amount has to be in such a size that it drives behavior, not just the cost, because then it's just annoying. It has to be really high, a really significant amount of cost on top. That funding should go back into the industry, and then they can challenge that then they can operate that in a circular system, and where the government come in, because they are the one that can collect this. In the EU, we are now having the innovation fund. The shipping industry, from I represent, will send a lot of money into different countries, into the EU, and here the government has the opportunity and possibility to establish green corridors. You can start with the corridor from Norway to UK as an example, or you can go to Rotterdam to Singapore, and you need to share the risk there as well. So the government can allocate that money in order to bring down the differences. So you can have contracts of difference with a green fuel compared to the a more expensive green fuel compared to the alternative fuel. So that's where an example where government can come in and really drive behavior.
Thanks. And just back to you for a second, Ruth. I'm interested, obviously you've got a positive story with government, but we've had quite a few false starts. So I'm surprised there's trust there, to be honest.
I think what I was trying to explain was that it took some money from government and a program to drive people regionally to work together closer in the industry. We're helping them work together nationally between regions to drive stuff forward. I think we've had a lot of delays in the CCUS program. So I would say there is, I think, trust that things, we work with the civil service very closely, that things are continuing even through this election period and so forth. There's very clear deadlines for getting contracts signed, the final investment decisions. Nothing is really a success, I have to say, until the final investment decision is made on the project. So whilst I think the cluster program and the work to develop the clusters has been really good, the pace has been too slow. In 2020, Boris Johnson said that we needed to have whatever it was, the 4 clusters by 2030. We're in 2024 and we haven't made any final investment decisions yet. I'm hoping they'll be made before the end of the year, but it really also does require, and this is maybe something a bit more of a political point, but there is also cross-party collaboration. When we were trying to get the energy bill, the government was trying to get the energy bill through the House last year, which created this regulated asset-based model for CO2 infrastructure. That is really the government trying to say, this is a strategic national asset and we will make sure it is provided at a sensible price for industry that needs to use it and so forth. And all the spending powers for the contracts for difference mechanisms, similar to what you were saying we needed in shipping. We have those designed. They're all ready to go. But the negotiations on the price of those is still going on. But last year when we were trying to get all of that through Parliament, we were briefing across all the parties. And the really good thing is there is cross-party support for net zero still. There is cross-party support for things like CCUS. So we have to kind of work with everyone to get this stuff forward. But we need to pick up the pace. The UK is so slow in taking decisions. I was showing photos earlier. I was in Norway yesterday looking at the Northern Lights facility. It's on time, on budget. They built it. They took the final investment decision in I think it was 2018. They started designing the project in 2014. It's a fantastic piece of engineering. It's built and it's shiny new, and it'll be ready to take the CO2 later this year. The problem is the capture plants that are meant to be sending them the CO2, they've been delayed. So again, that would not have worked if that hadn't been funded. That was 80% funded by government. So again, governments do have a role in pump priming the industry and getting the first infrastructure in place. And the UK is not moving quick enough on that. Others are going much faster and showing more leadership at the moment.
Unzall, can I bring you in?
Yeah, absolutely. So I will approach this from a slightly different point of view in terms of government on the one hand, so partnering with the government for legislative frameworks around the ETS and how that's been really successful for the industrial sector, but then also with voluntary frameworks like the SBTI and the GHG protocol. So in the context of we've worked with this, I'm not allowed to specify any names on a panel, so let's say a leading chemical producer headquartered in Germany. We work with them because chemical sector, of course, a lot of the feedstock that they use is purely methane or it's hydrogen, and then they'll split that to produce other secondary chemical products. But also just across industry, gas is a very large part of where the source of emissions are coming from. So with the EU ETS mechanism, and Europe has done this really well, we're still waiting for DESNZ to replicate this for the UK ETS, is that they really encourage the industrial sector to uptake, or any sector that's impacted by the ETS scheme, to uptake biomethane. And as a result, they can benefit from a reduction in the ETS obligations that they need to pay, because they're, of course, now decarbonizing the source of their product emissions. So with this chemical company, what we did with them through partnership with their sustainability team, but also with their financial team that was overseeing the ETS purchasing, was to help them implement biomethane, so certified biomethane, which is essentially just green gas, implement it into the early stage of their chemical production. As a result, they had to purchase less ETS obligations, so they were able to actually use that to finance the green gas purchasing and then run several low-carbon chemical product lines. So that partnership worked very well. And we then saw that there were other chemical companies who were also interested now in looking at decarbonizing their feedstocks, switching to biomethane and running low-carbon product lines. But where there was a barrier, let's say, was that a lot of the guidance under the GHG protocol and the SBTI didn't really encourage companies to use biomethane because they were not allowed to account it as a reduction mechanism. So we then worked together under the working group for the GHG protocol to help them adjust that guidance, because obviously we understand the market very well. So I think they wanted a little bit more background into, okay, why would this be the right mechanism for decarbonizing Scope 1 emissions? So worked with them, partnered with them on it. They then were able to adjust the negative wording in their guidance, which meant that it was a lot more user-friendly for a lot of organizations that wanted to look at gas transition. However, the barrier then was that, unfortunately, the UK ETS doesn't provide the same recognition yet for biomethane. And it's not so much that DESNZ disagrees with it, it's just, as Ruth says, they're very slow, it's very low on the priority list for what they want to look at. So that was really the barrier on that side, but then very successful partnership in a wider sense, and helping companies more so, I guess, on the European side in that way.
Okay.
Well, I'm going to say something nice about the government then, but I think the challenge of what governments can do, I mean, it's not a UK challenge. I think it's true throughout Europe, throughout the world, particularly in the current financial situation. There isn't a lot of money. There's some money, but there isn't a lot of money to spend on these things. So governments naturally spend a lot of time thinking about what they can afford to support, who should take the risks in relation to that support, and how that's going to, well, to use Ruth's phrase, pump prime or bring in private sector investment. But working with government, it always takes much longer than it does to work with a private company. But that's also an inevitable part of the process of being careful about how public money is spent and justifying those decisions. And of course, all of us and the private sector need to help as much as possible with expediting that process. But let's take an example of a very successful UK process, and that's the contract for differences in relation to offshore wind. I've been a banker for a long time, and I've done alternative, low carbon, renewable technologies a bit for a long time. And if I was in a team meeting 25 years ago talking about some of the technologies I was working on, that would have been light relief for after the serious business of the day was discussed. And that was true of offshore wind when that started to be proposed. A lot of utilities and manufacturers thought this wasn't a serious technology. It was always going to be ludicrously expensive. Why do it? It's a waste of time. And the UK government put in place a mechanism called the two-way contract for difference, which essentially provided a fixed price for producers of offshore wind electricity. Though if the price went above that level, then money would come back to the UK electricity consumer. Of course, at the time, people said, yeah, that's never going to happen. And it produced power in its early stages at a cost which was perhaps 3 times the market price for electricity produced from conventional sources. So a straightforward subsidy to a new industry. And there was a lot of criticism saying, well, yeah, that's what we said would happen. This is throwing money away. What happened? Through the power of competition, the visibility this gave to the supply chain, that there were going to be more offshore wind projects in the UK. This happened in other places in Europe as well, but it was primarily in the UK. The price came down to a point where it's now comparable to electricity from lots of other sources. So these mechanisms can work if you demonstrate to industry that there is a supply chain opportunity and that it's worth investing in new technology and new factories, and you can show that those opportunities are going to be there. There is at least the opportunity to produce carbon transition assets at a level that is quite comparable with current costs. Now, that won't apply to all of the hard-to-abate sectors. There are going to be some where we're just going to have to face cost increases. But for governments, I think the key role is to help industry and commerce do what it does best, which is respond to a clear set of opportunities which are going to be out there for several years and produce solutions that can deliver those.
Yeah, I'd like to come in on that because that's the job I did before coming to the CCSA, and I think you're right. You know, we had to go to the Public Accounts Committee twice. First, after the contracts were let, because the first contracts were bilaterally negotiated, not auctioned, to be told off about how expensive they were, £180 per megawatt hour, outrageous. Why didn't we auction to begin with? We'd been had, we were stupid. Why hadn't we done that? And then second, I think another year or two later, to say, look, you now are auctioning them and the costs have come down. That's great, but you should have put clawback mechanisms in those first contracts, so you could have, because you've paying £180 per megawatt hour for 15 years. The good thing is, roll on 10 years, nobody says that to me now. Everybody says, oh, what a brilliant scheme. Look how we, got the offshore wind industry going. And the only thing we probably should have done better is got more of the supply chain. And the reason we didn't was because there was at the time a good plan of saying, every year we're going to auction and this is the volume we're going to auction, and to give that long-term visibility, that it then wasn't necessarily stuck to by successive governments. I think we're in this, I see CCS industry and hydrogen exactly at the point offshore wind was. It's a really good example because we're now using that CFD model for CCUS projects. But the problem is we're in the bilateral negotiation phase without the commitment to regular deployment over the next 5 or 10 years. And if we do that, we won't get those supply chain benefits. We won't get the technology made in the UK and as many of the jobs. So I think it's a really good example. But the decision making was quicker back then, and I think there was a real partnership between the Treasury and DEC. And I'd like to see that again. I think we should talk about sort of institutional, partnerships in government as well.
Yeah, to hear someone who was in a ministry talk favourably about the Treasury, I mean, that's an extraordinary thing.
I'm not saying it was easy, but we actually did this thing where we all went to a neutral place away from Whitehall, not meeting in any department, and we were locked in a room 2 days a week till we agreed it. It took 6 weeks. But we need that with the climate crisis.
And that was a huge success. I mean, what I think, and we've got to see the challenges from the government's perspective, which is the worry that the Public Accounts Committee or the National Audit Office is going to turn around to civil servants and say, you've been had by industry. Some clever negotiator has turned around and made you transfer public money that didn't need to be transferred. And that's why often there's this extended process. But it's the visibility that governments can provide, not necessarily subsidy. Sometimes that may be necessary, but it's visibility and certainty that then really helps people like me when we're talking to investors, we're talking to lenders, demonstrate that there is a real project here, there are real opportunities, and that it's worth people spending their time understanding new technologies, looking at the real risks that often exist in the supply chain. I mean, we've seen huge inflationary risks, for example, in the last couple of years, all very relevant to providers of finance. So it's finding ways to manage all those risks collectively. I think that's likely to be the solution to this big challenge.
And you will need also bold politicians to do that. And as I mentioned, the green corridors, just an example from my country, from Norway. So the politicians there, Norway has a lot of fjords. And in order to have efficient traveling there, you need to use ferries to cross the fjords. So the government said that, okay, the government is handling and they are giving the licenses to the ferry. And they said that on this stretch, you need to have a zero vessel, a zero ferry to do that. We're going to pay what is needed. The market is not there. Those ferries does not exist. It doesn't exist, the electrical ferries, gas ferries at that time. But the government said, okay, but that's what we want. So they started doing that, and it started developing a market for that. And then suddenly the product started developed. There are more competition, and now I don't have the exact number, but most of all our ferries in Norway are now electrical capability and runs on electricity, and we are producing that in green electricity as well from hydropower. So just an example where they use the procurement power and set the standard, and then the commercial industry will follow.
Thanks. And do you think, just coming back to the wind example for a moment, because obviously the latest round, didn't really go anywhere, didn't get any pickup. Do you think that's an example of an erosion of a partnership, or is it just a bad stakeholder management?
I think it's a lack of flexibility and an inability to take more risk in the government. So what happened was that, and also I suppose not listening a bit. So I mean, I'm not in the offshore wind industry as I was back then, but I'm still obviously in touch with a lot of people there. And I mean, essentially the industry was saying, look, there's been all this inflation in the supply chain, as we were mentioning before, and we don't think we can make the same prices. We can't have ever decreasing prices. At some point there's a bottom, and then global events might make prices go up a bit for a while, then they might go down again. But this is, because we're so close to the bottom with these strike prices, it's very affected by any sort of shocks upward in the supply chain, which there were many. And the government was sort of like, well, we can't change this, and we're not changing it. We don't think there's enough evidence to make that case. And I do understand from the inside as well that burden of proof the civil servants have to find is quite heavy, and the bar is very high, and it is difficult, and you haven't got much time. Ministers are covering lots of topics. However, you can see the disastrous effect of that, and the fact that you'll have to catch up and build more. And this start for the supply chain is really bad, because they need continuous work to keep these factories going. So,
yeah, it's a big challenge, because I think for governments to negotiate bilaterally, that's very hard for the government, because how on earth do you know that you've got the best deal? equally it's hard for the companies involved. I think this year's auction will go a lot better. I'm looking for a bit of wood to touch. I'm sure it will go a lot better. Last year's was disappointing from pretty much all angles. And we're going to have bumps along the road like that, where we look at the challenge that public policy has in achieving value for money with the credibility of the explanations from industry as to why costs have gone up. And there was a horrible series of inflationary shocks in the supply chain, and those are now working through. They're still there to some extent. Hopefully those will calm down post the sort of long tail of COVID and the war in Ukraine. But again, these are the big challenges that we need to collectively work through, so that governments are happy to take decisions and run the risk of being sued or whatever, because they're confident they're making the right public policy decisions.
And I have to say, I'm not sure if that's just a phase, or it's, I can see we're going to have some of these shocks going forward, because it's very clear to me, going around to different capitals talking about CCUS and seeing all the different industrial carbon management strategies, plans coming out of different governments, that everyone's gone, oh, actually 2030 is really close, we'd better get our strategy out, we better find some money and create an incentive plan and start legislating for CFDs and start doing grants and whatever. And everybody is going to be dry. I mean, what's happened recently is, yes, wars, but also the Inflation Reduction Act and the amount of money going into developing these technologies in the US, which has drawn some of the supply chain away from Europe, just at the time when Europe is trying to ramp up as well. So this is the consequence of leaving it late. Lord Stern told us. He told us a decade or more ago. We have a window now to do this as cheaply as possible and be ready in time. If we leave it, if we put it off, it'll cost more. And that's, I think, where we're ended up, unfortunately. So we're all going to have to get to grips with that. But it's that messaging to the public that I think is a bit... The strong leadership is not just about taking those decisions, but actually selling those decisions to the public, because we're the ones that bear the cost ultimately.
And let's talk about another sector briefly that's really important to the hard-to-decarbonise sectors, which is solar power. Again, solar power costs went through a similar trajectory to offshore and onshore wind, from being seen as way too expensive. The application, particularly of Chinese manufacturing techniques, has pushed these costs down now to very low levels, so that in many places, not perhaps so much the UK, but many other countries, these can be producing electricity at very, very competitive, low costs. And these are going to be very important as an essential component of the supply chain to a lot of the hard-to-abate sectors. So again, this works. Given the right incentives, given the right sort of international cooperation, these things can be achieved. They're not impossible. We don't have to believe we're locked into a very, very high-cost decarbonisation process, which will inevitably make us all poorer. There may be some sectors where that is the case, but not all of them. And it's worth bearing that message in mind.
Thanks. I want to pick up on the international collaboration point and bring something up that you mentioned earlier, Unzall, around learning from our international colleagues. And I was wondering if you could pick up on that point and say a bit more about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, is everyone in the audience familiar with what a REGO or a GEO is? No? Okay, well, this plays a really big part into international mechanisms, first of all, around renewable energy transition. So REGOs, GEOs, a REGO for the UK, for example, it's a renewable energy certificate. So for every 1 megawatt hour of green energy that goes into our grid, you need a REGO to prove that it's there. And it's the bedrock for a PPA, it's the bedrock for your green tariff, for if you're just sourcing REGOs from the wider market. And then a GEO is just the European version of the certificate. Now, why does this matter so much? So historically, and this is really why, for example, the cost of renewable energy, we've seen a huge change in it over the last year and a half, 2 years. historically, the UK would import about 60% of their renewable energy certificates, so whatever we're disclosing to Ofgem under the fuel mix disclosure, we would import 60% of that from Europe because we shared a grid with Europe, we were interconnected. When Brexit came into play, that policy changed as of the beginning of this year, so we essentially cut about 60% of the supply that companies needed to buy to claim on their energy transition, that utilities needed to buy to disclose to Ofgem what their fuel mix was. We cut 60% of that supply beginning of 2024. Now this is really relevant for the industrial sector because while solar panels are brilliant, they're not going to be the leading tool to decarbonize power in the industrial sector. They cover just a fraction of what industry is consuming. Steel producers, for example, will consume like 4% of our grid. So that's where the REGO or the GEO really comes into play because that's what drives this whole market and pricing for the market. So what we saw was that because the supply was cut from that side, renewable energy in the UK started to become very expensive because there was a real scare around how will we have enough supply to fulfill our fuel mix disclosure. And obviously this was driven much more from utilities. Now, industrial corporates, they can still source from EU renewable energy sources because we still share the grid, but utilities cannot. Utilities are the ones who control the prices of renewable energy, really, if you rely solely on a green tariff. So if they're setting the pricing, and we saw that REGOs, for example, were at £28 per megawatt hour at the end of last year because this policy had just been announced. But then when companies see that, they're like, oh my gosh, I'm pulling out of my target, it's way too expensive, I can't afford to cover 100,000 megawatt hours of my power consumption anymore because that's, over £2.8 million just for a year for the industrial sector. So, and touching to the point about like better learning from our neighbors in Europe, what Europe does though is that they say, okay, the Nordic region produces most of our renewable energy, but they're interconnected with Spain, they're interconnected with France, with Germany, so let's share our renewable energy. And as a result, energy transition in Europe is way more cost effective. Like you have guarantees of origin in Europe that are costing €3-4 per megawatt hour, and it's like £18 in the UK. So it's very different. And I think where industry, I think, needs to be more strategic and I guess more market aware then on how they look at the renewables market, how they look at purchasing, because the more that we heavily rely on solely looking at utilities, solely looking at tariff providers, then you're very much at the mercy of how volatility in this market goes up and down. And you cannot really say, okay, I want a long-term energy transition plan, but I'm going to make it in a way that's financially viable. So I think how we can maybe learn from Europe is, as a whole, European companies are much more open-minded in terms of learning from players in the market, learning from their industry peers on how they're looking at decarbonisation, how they're looking at energy transition, and then trying to mimic that. And I think the UK private sector, at least, is they're very competitive in that space. They look less towards their competitors to learn, but more just very insular, which doesn't, as a whole, help anyone.
Great, thank you. We're running out of time, so I'm going to put a very quick final question to you all. And what's the key piece of advice you would give when trying to build a partnership? Start with you, Ruth.
I think obviously it's the really clear common shared goal is really, really important. But you talked about trust earlier. I do actually think there's a great deal of trust that has led to things like the Norwegian CO2 shipping infrastructure, or some of this early mover stuff. There is a lot of trust required between competitors, between people in industry, as well as between government and regulators and industry. So I would say yes, of course, make sure you really define your common goal well. and have honest conversations about the risks, where you can take a bit more risk, each of you, to get there. But it is, you do need to build the personal relationships, and you do need to have trust to move forward in the first mover space.
Yeah, so I tend to answer some those kind of questions with almost the same answer each time. I think it's essential that you start with the materiality assessment, looking at what is material to you, and then identify where can I make the most impact, and then you can look at what kind of partnership can we do to address that. And that, because that's reduced the risk that you do wrong partnerships or partnerships or activities with less impact. So on your question of an advice, I think that do the double materiality, do a serious job on that one, and look at how can you have partners contributing to reducing the negative impact.
Thank you.
I think it's really about getting stakeholders all across your company really on board with what the sustainability teams and what the procurement teams want to do. So having that open conversation with your board, with your financial team, understanding what do you want to achieve, what is the finance that is required to achieve it, what are the risks in place, and then collectively how can you work together to achieve it, but then also learn from what potentially peers in your industry are doing, and how we can be more open about our success stories to then advocate for public policy and try and replicate that across the industry.
Thanks, Mark.
So I think in all these cases, you need to find partners with whom you've got a shared objective. And once you've agreed on the objective, you need to think and have what will be very difficult discussions about the risks you can take and the risks they can take, and how the balance between those things work. Those won't be easy discussions. They never are, but but equally they can be very fruitful ones. And when they work in the right sort of trust environments we've heard about, those are the things that are going to produce the sort of partnerships that we'll need to see.
That's great. Thank you so much. It's been a great discussion. Thanks, panel, and thanks so much for listening. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.